It is a distinct privilege to speak at this silver anniversary of the entry of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic into the NATO alliance. It's most appropriate that this gathering is at the Presidential Library that memorializes Harry S. Truman, for it was President Truman who fathered the NATO alliance 75 years ago. Who am I to address you today? That's a fair question. So many others were active in bringing about the expansion of the NATO alliance in 1999. We salute them all. Back in the 1990s, I was teaching international politics at my university in Milwaukee. But my academic work was deepened by my concern for the people of East Central Europe and for Poland, the land of my grandparents. I was active in the Polish American Congress, which from its founding in 1944 had worked for the freedom, independence, and well-being of Poland and its citizens. Indeed, the Congress was the first American organization to denounce the great powers' decisions at Yalta as a betrayal of their World War II ally Poland. It was also the first to denounce the Allies for the failure to carry out the mission of the Atlantic Charter, which had affirmed the territorial and political integrity of all states, small and large. In August 1980, the Congress supported the Solidarity Trade Union movement, just days after its birth. And in fall 1989, a delegation of the Congress's leadership, headed by its president, Edward Moskow, was in Poland to affirm the Polish-American community's support for Prime Minister Tadeusz Mazowiecki's newly created post-communist government. Furthermore, in 1992, the Congress formally backed Poland's entry into the NATO alliance, which it recognized as vital to Poland's future prospects. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, there were people of influence who thought differently. Some proposed dissolving NATO since the Cold War was over. Others agreed to maintain the 16-member alliance, but they opposed its expansion. Poland's new government, headed by its president, Lech Wałęsa, saw things very differently. They knew that Poland and its neighbors' history very well, and they understood how important NATO membership was for their national security and as a symbol of their inclusion into the great transatlantic community of free peoples. In supporting this view, the Polish-American Congress organized a big campaign in December 1993 to make President William Clinton aware of their views. Its members barraged the White House with thousands of telegrams, letters, postcards, emails, and phone messages calling for NATO's expansion. The effort worked and got the president's attention. And here is where I came into the picture. It was on Monday, January the 2nd, 1994. I was at my university preparing for the spring semester when I got a surprising call from the White House. I was told that President Clinton was to speak in Milwaukee on U.S. foreign policy that Friday, and that a substantial number of Polish Americans needed to be invited to attend this last-minute event. Could I put together a list of local Polish Americans with their telephone numbers, and could I fax it to Washington as soon as possible? Yes, I could, and yes, I did. That Wednesday, I got another call from the White House. Would I be able to attend a meeting the next evening at the Pfister Hotel in anticipation of the president's visit? I agreed, and that Thursday, January the 5th, I was one of 18 guests, 9 of us Polish Americans, among them President Moskow, the Polish American Congress's executive director, Leszek Kuczynski, Jan Nowak of Radio Free Europe, and Professor Stan Blavas from Connecticut. 5 members of the Hungarian-American community were there, along with 2 each from the Czech and Slovak American communities. From Washington came Alexis Herman, who would later become U.S. Secretary of Labor. There was also Deputy National Security Advisor Samuel Berger, and the State Department's Daniel Fried, who would later become U.S. Ambassador to Poland. They were accompanied with a bevy of staff people. Following dinner, Ms. Herman opened up our discussion by simply asking us, "What's on your mind?" What followed was amazing. For the next 2+ hours, everyone who spoke, including me, called on the government to support NATO's expansion. Folks who were handpicked by the White House and together for the very first time were all speaking with one voice. Significantly, none of our White House hosts said a word. Around 10 o'clock at night, Ms. Herman rose to remind us of our meeting with the president following his public address the next morning. Was the meeting over? No. President Moscow rose to say that he and several others had not yet had the chance to speak. Ms. Herman sat down, and Moscow then succinctly condemned the administration for its failure to support NATO expansion, and he called it nothing less than a second Yalta. His words brought an immediate response from the then silent White House delegation. "No, don't say that, sir." It was as if Moscow had placed their fingers into an electric socket. Our discussion then continued past midnight. As we adjourned, President Moscow, Professor Blavas, and I noticed something, that the White House people and their staff were not going anywhere. They were staying put. Were they revising the president's speech for the next morning? On Friday morning, January the 6th, 1994, Vice President Albert Gore, subbing for President Clinton, whose mother had just passed away, spoke at the Pabst Theater to some 1,000 people, over 200 of them Polish Americans. There he used words and phrases from our meeting from the night before. NATO expansion, he more than implied, was indeed on the table. When our group met with Mr. Gore after his speech, we covered the same ground as the night before. At the end, he invited us to the White House to meet with the president following his return from his trip to NATO headquarters in Brussels. On March the 2nd, 1994, we had that meeting. It was very frank. At the end, Mr. Clinton said something that hit me hard. He declared, and I quote, "The door to NATO expansion is open," unquote. Really? How significant was our Milwaukee meeting? In January 1998, 4 years later, Mr. Nicholas Ray, our former U.S. ambassador to Poland, was in Milwaukee. His mission was to win over critics of NATO expansion in Wisconsin and around the country. I hosted a luncheon for him, attended by dozens of community leaders. There, as we exchanged luncheon pleasantries, I mentioned my participation at that January 5th, 1994. He dropped his knife and fork, and he turned to me. "You were there?" They were talking about that meeting for 6 months in Washington. "You folks," he said, "had a big impact in changing our country's foreign policy." Then he added, "Well, not only you." He was absolutely right. So many others had made the case for NATO enlargement. Madeleine Albright, who would become Secretary of State in 1999, and General John Shalishkashvili, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There was Professor Zbigniew Brzezinski, and U.S. Senators Barbara Mikulski of Maryland, Hank Brown of Colorado, Paul Simon and Richard Durbin of Illinois, Richard Lugar of Indiana, and many, many others. Myra and Kazimir Leonard of the Polish American Congress in Washington, D.C. also played a key role. Together, they worked with our fellow Americans of East Central European origins to create the Central and East European Coalition. Its 19 organizations brought together 13 different nationality groups to express the support of 20 million Americans for NATO expansion. Their lobbying focused on the 100 members of the Senate of the United States, since a 2/3 vote of that body was required in order to amend the NATO treaty and enable its expansion. Special thanks here go to Edward Moskal, who was engaged in the expansion effort for 7 full years. I will never forget how he electrified that January 5th, 1994 meeting. And of course, President Clinton deserves so much credit. He was a chief executive who listened and who acted. One last personal memory. In early 1998, I had the chance to work with Mr. Ryszard Sarkowicz, Poland's Consul General in Chicago, and with members of the Wisconsin State Legislature to win a joint resolution from the legislature in support of NATO expansion. Did that vote mean much? Well, on April 30th, 1998, both of our U.S. senators from Wisconsin, Herb Kohl and Russell Feingold, voted for NATO expansion. The Senate vote was 80-19, and in the 14 states where the Polish American Congress was most active, the vote was 26-2 for NATO enlargement. Clearly, lots of other folks were also doing similar things around the country. Today, we look back with pride at this singularly great achievement. 3 countries whose citizens had courageously ended Soviet domination and without violence had joined NATO 10 long years after those extraordinary events of 1989. NATO expansion represented a victory for peace, progress, solidarity, and national security. One that began a process of NATO expansion that today unites the citizens of 32 very diverse countries, all around the principle of collective self-defense. NATO is the shield defending the lives and hopes of 950 million people in Europe and in North America. In short, NATO matters. It mattered in 1949, it mattered in 1999, it matters today. Thank you very much.